I've been an amateur astronomer for over 45 years, ever since I was 7 years old when I first got my Jason 60 millimeter refractor. And during that time, I've seen some amazing things in the sky, either with my naked eye, through binoculars, or through a telescope. And so I thought I would take some time to share some of those with you. The first is a large solar prominence that I saw in October of what year I can't remember. One of the things the Kalamazoo Astronomical Society does is a great deal of community outreach. And so in October of some year, I was sharing views of the sun at Crane Fest in Calhoun County, Michigan. So I set up my telescope. I don't think it was the one pictured here. This is me with my Lunt 60 millimeter hydrogen alpha telescope on an Astrophysics Mach 1, but I'm pretty sure the telescope that I had at the time was my Teleview Pronto with a 40 millimeter Coronado filter. So I set that up. I pointed at the sun and I saw something very similar to this. In fact, when I first saw the sun through the telescope that day, this was the image that came to my head because I've been seeing this image since I was a little kid. This is an ultraviolet image of the sun taken on December 19th, 1973 aboard Skylab. And what I saw was very similar to this, a large solar prominence, not quite as broad as this one, but definitely as big. So clearly what I was seeing was part of a coronal mass ejection in progress. And oftentimes you do see large prominences blow away with the coronal mass ejection. And that's definitely what I was seeing that day. So if you have any idea what year this was, please let me know, but it was pretty cool. And I was getting really excited and encouraging people to view through the telescope. And I don't know if you've ever shared views of the sun and hydrogen alpha before, but the most common comment is, all I see is red, because people just don't see detail right away when looking at the sun in hydrogen alpha. And some people were amazed, but nobody got quite as excited as I did, because in years of looking at the sun like this, it was just an amazing sight to see something so big moving away from the sun. And it never collapsed in on itself. It absolutely blew away from the sun, never to return. Then I saw this bright green fireball September 27th, 2013. I was at Richland Township Park with my students. We were working on our constellation assignment. I was showing them deep sky objects through a telescope as part of an extra credit project. And when all that was done, they left and I was there by myself to pack up and saw this flash in the southeast that made me turn my head in that direction. And then I got to see the rest of it, and was it so bright, and man, was it green. So the green color told me right away that this was an iron meteor composed of iron and nickel. It most likely did not become a meteorite. So when I got home, I submitted my report to the American Meteor Society and saw this chart later, and obviously several other people saw it as well, because if you were outside, it was kind of hard to miss. So it was visible across many Great Lakes states and slightly beyond. And the really cool thing about this bright green meteor is I do have a video to remember it by. I grabbed this off the internet from someone that posted it. Unfortunately, I don't know who, but here it is. So you can see it kind of slightly flashed there at first, and then I got to turn my head and I got to see the really bright part here. I can't quite estimate the magnitude of this, but it was definitely around the brightness of a full moon here at its absolute most vivid. And unfortunately, this is a monochrome video, but take my word for it, it was green. And boy, was that cool. So now, a Mars opposition is not a great spectacle through a telescope. In fact, it takes a lot of patience to look at Mars, even when it's at its best. But the opposition of Mars in 2003 was very special. I mean, yeah, you get an opposition of Mars every 26 months, Not all are the same, of course, because Mars has a pretty elliptical orbit. But every 15 to 17 years, you get a perihelic opposition where Mars is pretty close to Earth, a lot closer than it usually is at opposition. But in 2003, Mars was technically closer to Earth than it had been in 60,000 years. And because of this fact, it generated a great deal of publicity. So the KAS did Mars Watch at the Kalamazoo Nature Center on August 27th, 28th, 2003, and it was probably the biggest event we've ever had. I mean, we estimate we had at least 1,200 people in our kind of relatively small observing area at the Kalamazoo Nature Center. Both parking lots were full at the Nature Center. Cars were parked all up and down the long driveway to the parking lots. And once those filled up, people were telling me they had to park on Northwestnedge because they couldn't find anywhere else to park, and they had to walk up. And some people even told me that they were in line for 3 hours to look at Mars through our 12-inch in Owl Observatory at the Nature Center. But that wasn't the best night for me. The best night, as you can see on the slide here, was on September 6, 2003. I went out to the Nature Center by myself on a very humid night. Here I am with the 12-inch with Mike Sinclair on the right. He wasn't there. Again, I was by myself. And I looked at Mars because it was clear, you know, oppositions of Mars don't occur very often. I've been a Mars nut since I was a little kid. So I pointed my telescope, or the club's telescope, at Mars and looked through the eyepiece, and I was like, wow, it's pretty steady. Why don't I try to use more power? So I kept using more power, and finally I had Mars the size of a quarter in the eyepiece, and it was rock solid, and I was just gawking at it for the longest time because you don't get nights like that very often. It was just the most amazing view of Mars I've ever had. And you know that's rare. You just don't get the ideal seeing conditions that often, especially in Michigan. And a similar story here. I've been seeing Saturn since I was, 7 years old with my Jason 60 millimeter refractor. I've seen it probably hundreds of times since then. But the best view was hands down at the 2005 Winter Star Party in the Florida Keys. Now, that region, they're known for having very good seeing conditions, unlike those of us up in Michigan. And so I set up my 10-inch LX200, and I was able to get Mars up to roughly 600 power, and it was rock solid. The rings were in full display, so that was clearly the best view of Saturn that I've ever had, like I would have, like I had with Mars a couple of years previous. Now, the first time I ever saw the Milky Way from a truly dark site out in the desert where it's high and dry was at the 2001 Texas Star Party. And even when I first got there, even though it was overcast, I knew we were in for a good week if it was going to ever clear up, because there were thin clouds overhead when we arrived kind of near night, and you could look overhead and see the Coma Berenices star cloud shining through the clouds. And I'd never seen the Coma star cluster outside of a planetarium before, and just seeing it through clouds, I knew we were in for a good time. And I remember the night in May 2001 well, when I really saw the Milky Way well, is it was cloudy at first, but then a member woke me up at 3 a.m. saying, Richard, it's clear, it's clear. So I dragged myself out of my bunk and took this hour-long image here with my film camera. So, yep, this is with a good old-fashioned film camera, and I basically just left the shutter open for an hour as the camera rode piggyback on top of the telescope. So that's why everyone's trailed here. And this image was really quite popular back in the early to mid 2000s. I have found it on, other websites since then. Just people sharing the image. They didn't like steal it or anything. They did give credit, at least in most cases. But I also remember being at the Great Lakes Stargaze years ago. Some guy was giving a presentation, some professional astronomer, and boop, up comes my image of the Milky Way at the 2001 Texas Star Party, and he did not give credit. And this was a unusual year because here you can see this bright thing right in the Milky Way, and that is Mars again. So I went back the following year because we had such a good time the previous year, and I took this 15-minute image here, and by this time Mars was long gone. So I managed to go back and get a picture of the Milky Way with no Mars in it. More red lights, but this time they were a little more cropped out. Pretty good though. Now, again, this is not a great visual spectacle, but this gets a listing because they are rare. I mean, to date, there have been only 7 transits of Venus seen by humans, at least confirmed. Only 7. Just imagine how many, dozens or hundreds of comets and how many total solar eclipses people have seen. But we've only got to see 7 transits of Venus since the year 1639. And so for the first one on June 8th, 2004, I traveled to Maine. I was specifically on top of a mountain called Mount Agamenticus because this was the morning transit. As the sun rose, the transit was in progress, and we knew we were going to get fog in Maine, so we went to the highest elevation we could find. And I can remember seeing the sun rise above that fog below, and it was just a beautiful sight. But then we got to see the transit of Venus, and of course for pretty much everybody, this was the first time anybody alive had ever seen a transit of Venus. But then we got one 8 years later on June 6, 2012, and we had another huge event, almost as big, I think, as the Mars opposition in 2003 at Warren Dunes State Park on the shore of Lake Michigan, because pretty much everyone inland had clouds to contend with. But for those of us on the lakeshore, it was very clear. But unfortunately, it was kind of windy that day. So here I am adjusting a 80 millimeter refractor with my sun funnel, and I snapped this picture shortly thereafter. And out of all the pictures that were taken that day, this is my favorite. I don't know why I like it, but I just like it so much because you got the sun there looking kind of nice and yellow, and you can see some sunspots, but you see just this little black dot right there, and that was Venus on the face of the sun. And once it was gone, that was the last time anybody would ever see it in their lifetime, because the next one won't occur until 2115 or something like that. It doesn't matter because we'll all be dead then. So if you missed it, sorry. Now, the next 2 entries were seen through this Dobsonian. This is the Yard Scope, a 36-inch Dobsonian owned by Crazy Bob Summerfield. He ran this astronomy outreach program called Astronomy to Go with his wife. And he was a big fixture at star parties back then. I'm not sure what he's up to today, if anything. But the first time I got to look through this telescope was not this one, but the next entry. But this is the second time I got to look through this telescope in February 2005 at the Winter Star Party, and it was of the Horsehead Nebula. Obviously, it didn't quite look like this. This is just a nice image I thought I would share here. But he had this tall ladder, of course, set up, and obviously I think there were a lot of beginners in line because he kept having to explain what to look for over and over again, because I guess to the untrained observer, it wasn't terribly obvious. But I walk up the ladder, I begin to look through the eyepiece, Bob begins to explain what to look for, and I'm like, oh, there it is. And he was like, oh, thank goodness, because I don't have to explain it for the umpteenth time, because we've all been there, Bob. Don't worry about it. But I've tried to view the Horsehead before from the Nature Center through our 12-inch in the observatory that we had at the time. And I can clearly remember following the bright emission nebula, IC 434, and then it suddenly stopped and then started up again. So we could tell where the Horsehead Nebula was. It's just that we couldn't make out the shape at all. The skies at the Nature Center are just too light polluted. But through that 36-inch Dobsonian, it was plain as day. And so it's such an iconic figure that it just stands out in my head. Now, the first time that I looked through the 36-inch was again at the 2001 Texas Star Party. And so I walked up the tall ladder, looked at M51, something I saw many times. I thought I knew what to expect, and I was just blown away. It just looked like a completely different galaxy, like this really vividly bright one that is somehow overlooked all these years. It was just an incredible sight. And so I share this image here because, or this sketch here, because when I first saw the Whirlpool Galaxy through that scope, this is what I thought of. This is a sketch of the Whirlpool Galaxy by Lord Ross William Parsons in Ireland, who viewed this galaxy for the first time, or at least the first time through a really big telescope, the 72-inch Leviathan of Parsonstown in the late 19th century. And so based off of this sketch, the spiral nebulae thing became a topic of discussion. Many people thought they were stars in the process of forming, but it turned out they were in fact galaxies. And this was the first spiral galaxy ever designated as such. So this image is pretty historic. And when I saw the Whirlpool Galaxy, this is what I thought of. And every time I looked at the Whirlpool Galaxy since then, I'm like, it doesn't look as good as it did through the 36-inch at the Texas Star Party, and I can't imagine it ever will. So on this list, we clearly have to have a couple of bright comets. The first bright comet I ever saw was Comet Hyakutake in March 1996. And this thing came on the scene pretty quick. It was discovered on January 31st, 1996 by Yuji Hyakutake in Japan. And this comet became quite famous for several reasons. It came to within 1/10 of an astronomical unit of Earth, or 9.3 million miles of Earth, which was closer than any comet in 200 years. And it was pretty bright. I think for us, it maxed out around magnitude 0. So it was a very obvious sight. But what was most remarkable about this comet, in addition to it being very close to Earth, was that it had a long tail. Many people prefer Hyakutake over the next comet that I'll talk about because the tail was so magnificently long. And I can remember a night in March 1996 out at Astropad, the observatory of the late KAS member Dave Moore, and we were looking up at the comet, me, Dave, Pete Mumbauer, and Pete just commented, "I can see the comet move." And I was like, "Yep, Pete, that's what they call an orbit." But it was remarkable. You could just look up and with your eyes see this thing slowly move in the sky when it was closest to Earth. But for me, my favorite was Comet Hale-bopp. Now, this one was discovered before Comet Hyakutake. It was found on July 23rd, 1995 by Alan Hale and Thomas Bopp from different locations in the western US. And this comet became quite the spectacle, and it was visible with the naked eye for a record 18 months. You know, no comet in the history of bright comets has been visible to the naked eye as long as Hale-bopp, and it got pretty bright. And you could walk out, you know, in front of your house in a light polluted neighborhood and say, "Oh, there it is," and clearly see the two tails, the very nice short stubby dust tail and the long ion tail. And of course, we had big events at the Kalamazoo Nature Center that attracted hundreds of people, which just makes it even more memorable to share it with so many people. So it was the brightest comet I've seen in my lifetime so far, but I hope another comet surpasses it soon. But we've been waiting a long time now. So the next two entries are with another big Dobsonian. This one's a 20-inch obsession owned by KAS member Robert Wade. He's retired, living in New Hampshire now, but for a brief time, he moved back to Kalamazoo after growing up in the area. And he attended both winter star parties that I went to in 2005 and 2011. And in 2011, he pointed his 20-inch obsession at the Orion Nebula. And it was so close, you could really only see the Huygens region. So if you're not quite familiar, this is a Hubble Space Telescope image of the Huygens region of the Orion Nebula. It's basically this open cavity at the heart of the nebula carved out by the trapezium stars here. Now, obviously, I couldn't see the color even through Robert's 20-inch Dobsonian, but the detail was almost as vivid as the image here, but it appeared, more in a pearl gray light. And I just remember picking off several stars around the trapezium. I was even mentioning, oh, there's a star here, Robert. Did you see that one? He's like, no. And he looked very closely and he was like, oh, there it is. So I was picking out things that he wasn't spotting. So it was just beautiful. It was very much like the Hubble image, just without the color. Beautiful. But the best view I had through his telescope by far was at the February 2005 Winter Star Party. And so that time he pointed this 20-inch at Omega Centauri, the globular cluster of globular clusters, the most magnificent globular cluster in the sky. This thing has upwards of 10 million stars. So when he pointed his 20-inch obsession and put in his 31-millimeter Nagler and says, here you go, Richard, take a look, I screamed, holy expletive here, because I just lost control. And people came running because they heard me scream. They're like, what's wrong? What's wrong? And Robert's like, oh, Richard just saw Omega Centauri through my big Dob. And they're like, well, I got to take a look then. And of course, people were almost as amazed as I was. I mean, the view was very much like the image here, but probably a little tighter because I just remember the entire field of view of that 31 Nagler just packed with stars. Just amazing. Next is the brightest aurora I ever saw on November 7th, 2004. This particular image was taken fairly recently, October 2024, of auroral corona. The first time I've seen it since then, but on this date in 2004, it was much, much brighter. And I did take film pictures again because that's all I had back in those days. And seeing that auroral corona, which is, just aurora directly overhead, and so bright, so vivid, it looked like a, warp in the space-time continuum, like some special effect in an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. I kind of imagine the Enterprise getting pulled into this thing, or perhaps the Earth itself. And who knows, we might have got flung across the universe or something. But it was just aurora, but boy, was it so bright. And seeing it overhead was just a thrill of a lifetime. Still haven't quite repeated seeing something quite like that, although we did just have it happen again recently, but not nearly as vivid. So obviously on this list, I have to have the two total solar eclipses I've seen. I've only seen the two. The first was on August 21st, 2017. I traveled to Wyoming for that one to maximize the prospects of good weather, and it was mostly good. Mostly, I say. And then I traveled to Maine for the total solar eclipse on April 8th, 2024. And kind of go between the two here, 2017, 2024. It's hard to pick your favorite. It's like picking the favorite of two children or something like that. You just can't quite do it. But I guess if I really had to pick one, it would be the one in 2017, just because when I first saw those three coronal streamers, it was just so rad. That's kind of the word I often use to describe this to myself. And of course, it was my first time to seeing a total solar eclipse. So it was just extra memorable, but it's hard to go against 2024 too, because that was just as memorable. And the one thing everyone commented about that I saw as well is that really bright prominence at the bottom. Both were pretty spectacular. So that's number two. So we have two entries here tied at number two. What's number one? Any guesses? So for me, it is definitely the Great Comet Crash of 1994, without a doubt. So on July 16th, 1994, fragments of a comet called Shoemaker-Levy 9 began to impact Jupiter fragment by fragment. And this was a greatly anticipated event when this comet was first discovered. So the comet was discovered on March 24th, 1993 by a team named Eugene and Carolyn Shoemaker and David Levy, who is an amateur astronomer and comet hunter. And it was actually Carolyn Shoemaker, though, that spotted this comet for the first time on a photographic plate. And when she saw it, she described it as a squashed comet. So clearly, she knew right away there was something different about this comet. And so what happened is within the previous year or two, Jupiter captured this comet because when this thing was discovered, it became apparent that this was the first comet ever discovered in orbit around Jupiter. So this comet came too close to Jupiter a few years prior. Jupiter's gravitational tidal forces tore it apart into the string of pearls, as astronomers nicknamed it. And then it became apparent that the following year, this thing was going to impact Jupiter, which, as far as we know, no one had ever seen anything like this before. This was the first direct impact that we ever got to see. Well, it wasn't quite direct, because as you could see in the video, all the impacts happened on the nighttime side of Jupiter. So here's right after, I believe, the very first impact on July 16th, 1994, my mother's birthday, by the way. And here is kind of the right before picture. And then you see this mushroom cloud rise from behind the limb of Jupiter and gradually flatten out because of winds and Jupiter's gravity and all that sort of thing. Now, fortunately, Jupiter rotates on its axis in less than 10 hours, so the impact sites would quickly come into view. But what would we see? Astronomers were guessing we wouldn't see anything. They were warning amateur astronomers, don't get your hopes up. Odds are the impacts will be very light or bright and difficult to view from Earth, but boy, were they wrong. So fortunately, I had something a little bigger than my Jason 60 millimeter refractor. I hadn't quite taken delivery of my 10-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain yet, but fortunately, I worked at the local planetarium in town here at the Kalamazoo Public Museum, and I borrowed their 8-inch cave optical Newtonian. And for some reason, I decided to take a picture of it in my living room at my old house. I don't know why I didn't go outside, but my backyard wasn't very good to observe from back then. But here I am as a young man, probably 1992, 1993 or so, before the impact. So for 1994, I was at the new house in the backyard, all by myself, pointed the telescope at Jupiter. Now, let me set this up properly. I've been looking at Jupiter since I was 7 years old with my Jason 60 millimeter refractor. And so I pointed the telescope at Jupiter, looked through the eyepiece and focused, and what I saw blew me away. I mean, I'm not afraid to admit it. I flipped out because I just saw these little black spots on Jupiter, and to know what they were from, this comet, this broken up comet that hit Jupiter fragment by fragment, was the coolest thing I ever saw. And I just lost it. I just couldn't contain my enthusiasm. I was just running all over the house, and there was nobody around, so I decided to call Eric Schrewer, my boss at the planetarium and fellow KS member, and I was like, Eric, did you see it? Did you see it? And he's like, oh yeah, I saw it. You know, Eric's never been one to get really emotional, like I guess like me, but for me, it was just the most amazing sight because as I thought about it, people, you know, they've seen bright aurora, bright meteors, bright comets, total solar eclipses, but in the history of astronomy, nobody has ever seen anything quite like this before. This did kind of repeat itself in 2009 when a single fragment, maybe an asteroid or a comet, left a single dark spot on Jupiter. I saw that as well, but nothing was quite like the great comet crash of 1994. Absolutely, without a doubt, the coolest thing I have ever seen in the sky. So, what are the coolest things you've ever seen in the night sky? Obviously, if you're a member of the Kalamazoo Astronomical Society, you could just tell me, but it certainly would be a lot better to share it in the newsletter or maybe even give your own presentation about it sometime. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation and me reminiscing about the most, you know, amazing, coolest, awesome things I've seen in the sky as an amateur astronomer for the past 45 years. Thanks for listening.